I'm going to make an argument over the next few minutes, next 20 minutes or so, that I'm sure if you make a knee-jerk reaction to, I'm speaking to my fellow Christians right now, you might get angry, and I don't want you to. So stay with me, because I'm going to talk to you about something very important that's coming up here in the Easter season, and that is how Christians have obscured Christ in modern arguments, and how we can deliver the good news, what we love about our faith, in a much more meaningful manner. So that and more after this. Well, over my shoulder right now, you see the Garden Tomb in Israel. And I'm probably going to escape from that shortly. But because I am going to be talking about the resurrection this week, I thought it would be appropriate to start here in Israel, giving you a view of the Garden Tomb. Because I think that modern Christianity, by focusing on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ exclusively, have done a disservice to the person of Christ and to the faith. And I think we've lost a hearing with the whole generation. Now, before you go away or two now, don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing the resurrection. But I am saying that there has been this rabid focus on it in the discussion between Christians and atheists. As a matter of fact, go back 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and look at magazine articles, look at YouTube debates between Christians and atheists, and they all focus on the resurrection. Did it happen? Can we be sure? And is it the best argument for the birth of Christianity and so forth? And there's so much focus on that from both sides, from the skeptic side that's trying to poke holes in it, and from the Christian side that's saying this is the reason you should believe us, because there's an empty tomb. I want to suggest to you that there's a better way, and we're missing we're not being heard by the majority of the people listening. Just not being heard. They tune us out. And so let me start with a Beatles reference. Wendy and I were watching a documentary on Kurt Cobain, who was my age, born in 1967, or he would be my age if he was still here. Let me change the background so you're not distracted. But Kurt Cobain was talking about his love for the Beatles, and he said what really was moving to him was let's go here. What was moving to him was the progression from "I Want to Hold Your Hand" to Sgt. Pepper's, and how they had grown musically and had more to express. And that was really intriguing to him. Now I want to suggest something to you to get into this argument. I want to suggest, maybe you're my age or a little bit younger, what have you, but I want you to imagine yourself in a room, maybe at a family reunion. People of all different ages are there. You see some younger people sitting in the corner kind of being ignored just on their phones. You go over there and you sit with them and you try to engage. And of course, they take their earbuds out to be courteous and respectful, and you find out they were listening to music, and you ask them about, what kind of music they like and so forth. And they tell you some of the modern boom, boom, boom. They say, I don't even know the modern. Pearl Jam is the last band that I really pay attention to. I know that's dating me, but let's just say they drop a few names out. Taylor Swift and I don't know, Jay-Z and a few, Rihanna, a few others. And then you jump right in with, do you know the Beatles were the greatest band that ever existed, and they were the grandfathers of true rock and roll, and they laid the foundation for every other group to come down the line. Do you like the Beatles? Do you know they're the best band ever? What do you think the reaction's going to be of Generation Z? Yeah, what do you think they're going to be thinking? And do you think it'll end with the pejorative boomer, the thoughts in their mind? Do you think they'll roll their eyes? Do you think they'll tune out at that point? Because you've led with your conclusion. You have led with something that has been the culmination of your own experience, which they have no knowledge of. Absolutely none. Unless they grew up with good parents who turned them on to classic music, many of them probably don't know who the Beatles were. And you start with the Beatles are the best. And what have you not done? If you want to make an argument about the Beatles, I think it would be a little bit silly in that environment. But if you want to make an environment, or if you want to turn somebody on to the music you love, maybe you should share the music instead of your opinion or your conclusion about the music. Maybe you should tell a story about how when you were that age, what was the first album you bought? And you could actually have a conversation with them as human beings and find out what their first downloaded song was, because people don't buy albums anymore unless they're old, like me, or Peyton buys albums, but that's because she's related to me and I turned her on to vinyl. But most Christians ruin their conversations by leading with, the tomb's empty, the resurrection proves Jesus is God, what have you. And really it comes across as we're right and everyone else is wrong, and just accept what we're telling you. Just take our word for it. And what have you not done? You've not played the music. You've not introduced them contextually to how Jesus was different, to how he was revolutionary, to what was magical about him, to what was impressive, to what was influential. You've done none of the real work to share with somebody why you have this hope in your heart, why you have this love in your heart. I bring up the Beatles analogy because I've seen it happen. And I've seen younger people just roll their eyes, and it might not be a conversation about music, it might be about politics or the economy, or you all have heard your parents say, when I, back in the day, had to go to school, basically it comes across as your generation is less than. My generation really worked. My generation really had it hard. My generation really overcame and pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps. Your generation, you sit there with your phones. You come across as a get off of my lawn old fogey. And I bring this up because I think we do a disservice to Jesus, to Christ, to our own faith when we start there. And yet here we are, another Easter, and the arguments in Time magazine and on the shows and in the internet with apologists versus atheists are going to be, is the tomb empty? Was Jesus just a legend? And so forth. And I've seen this argument the other day in a social media group. An apologist said the following: for Christianity, everything stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. See, this is where modern apologetics has gone. They've stuck their flag in the ground. This is where they want to fight. This is the hill they want to die on, so to speak. Forgive the pun. And so the argument becomes focused around gospel contradictions. Are the gospels reliable? Uh, you know, all these arguments focus on a miracle that no one was around to witness. And what happens in the midst of this argument? Well, people never get to know Jesus. I mentioned to you that a younger group, most of them don't know the Beatles. They don't. One of my favorite stories from recent times had to do with Kanye West. He wrote a song about his dearly departed mother. It's a beautiful song. The only one, I think it's called. Beautiful song. Now, Postmodern Jukebox does a version of it that's 10 times better than the original, just as they did with Blank Space, the Taylor Swift song. So don't take my word for it. Go to YouTube, watch Taylor Swift do Blank Space, then watch Postmodern Jukebox do it and thank me later. But they did the same thing with Kanye's song, right? But on Kanye's original song, his version of this ode to his mother, how much love and respect he had for his mother and how he remembers her. It's a beautiful song, by the way. He was moved to reach out to Paul McCartney, of the Fab Four, and have him join him on this track, playing keyboards, because of Paul McCartney's ode to his mother in Let It Be. There's a similarity there. And Paul McCartney said yes, and he joined Kanye for this song. And Kanye put out the song, and on social media under it, you had all these Kanye followers commenting on the song and how great it was. And then there were a number of comments about this old man playing piano. And people were saying, who's that old guy playing piano? And somebody else would say, commented, this is a true comment, you could go back and look at it through the thousands of comments, but there was a true comment under, who's this old guy playing piano? Somebody said, this old man, Kanye just made this old man's career by letting him play on his song. And it kind of reminds me of a joke that was told about a friend of mine who had never married, but he's about my age, and he was only dating girls who were about half his age. Right? And one of his friends said to him, when he mentioned his girlfriend that he was dating, one of his friends said to him, is that the one that asked you if Paul McCartney was in a band before Wings? So here we have Paul McCartney, one of the most famous musicians, best songwriters in the world, and he's unknown to the Kanye generation. So much so, people think that him playing keyboards on Kanye's song is going to make him famous. But we're talking about a generation who's never gone to Sunday school. We're talking about a generation who doesn't know Jesus, the Jesus who goes to the woman at the well, the Jesus who heals the lepers, the Jesus who stands in between the adulterous woman and her accusers, the Jesus that challenges the self-righteous religious authorities of his day. They don't know any of these stories. They don't know of the Jesus that challenges Zacchaeus to be more than his money. They don't know anything about Jesus. The only thing they've heard about Jesus is the argument between these two loud groups who want to shout about whether there was an empty tomb or not. And a generation of Christians has forgotten how to tell the greatest love story ever told. A generation of Christians has forgotten what J.R.R. Tolkien shared with C.S. Lewis, an ardent atheist, which was, according to his own words, a story that every man wants to believe is true. Now, some people some people will agree with that apologist statement that Christianity, everything stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. The problem I have with it, and I know it's taken from the Apostle Paul, that we are of all men most miserable if Christ wasn't risen. But you know what happens when you begin there? I think it's actually crept in from Calvinism. And it's something called presuppositionalism, that you begin with there's a God. You don't entertain anything less than that. So you force this on anyone you're arguing with. No, of course there's a God. Everyone knows there's a God because Romans 1 says everybody in their God consciousness is aware of it. So we're just going to not make any arguments. We're not going to be rational. We're not going to listen critically to anything else. We're just going to start there and force the conversation to start there. And you know what happens? You lose a lot of people. A lot of people don't want to start there. And quite frankly, it's reasonable not to start there because you as a Christian, even if you believe what I just said, don't want to start with Muhammad riding a horse into heaven. And if somebody who's witnessing to you or testifying to you about Islam being truth, would you start there? Would you grant that? Would you cede that happened? A miracle that they believe in that you don't? Or that you're skeptical even happened? Does that make sense to you? And yet Christians do it all the time. They take for granted. And I would add to you, it's not really because they're trying to have a conversation with somebody. It's not really that they wanted to do the actual hard work of going back and remembering what first led us to be amazed by the grace that we see in Jesus Christ. It's just the old curmudgeon saying the Beatles were the best band ever. Now, I might agree with the old man that the Beatles were the best band ever. I might agree with the old man about how influential and inspirational and how great bands that followed them will point to the Beatles as their inspiration. We could go into all that, and yet I can see a whole generation that doesn't want to take your word for it, that has a different experience, that has their own experiences, and they feel that you haven't even listened to them. You haven't heard them about what has been meaningful in their musical upbringing, in their context. Maybe they'd be really interested in the story if you came at it a different way. And maybe if you came at it with a little humility, which, by the way, is exactly what we're told in the verse that tells us how to conduct ourselves as apologists. Be ready to give every man an answer, but it says humbly, and it says every man who asks of you. Who asks of you? Why do you take the name of Jesus? Why do you find Jesus Christ attractive? Why do you call yourself a Christian? What about Christianity is attractive to you? Now, somebody asked me about the Beatles. I'm going to have a lot to talk to them about. I'm going to start with what happened in my background. Well, I started with the Beach Boys, actually. The Beach Boys were my first rock and roll experience. In that little order tapes every week. You get 12 tapes for a penny. Cassette tapes, that's what it was back when I was doing it. I'd get 12 cassette tapes for a penny, and then you'd have to buy a cassette tape every month for, I don't know, $9.99 or $13.99 or whatever it was. It ended up being a ripoff, but that's how I got into music at first, and I was all about surfer rock and roll. Jan and Dean and the Beach Boys and so on. Dead Man's Curve. But eventually, that was Bella. Eventually, the Beatles revolutionized my understanding of music and the layers. And I had an ear for it. And I could talk about the Beatles forever if I'm asked. But here's the sin of it. when you lead with the Beatles are the best band ever, and you should believe it because of A, B, and C, to somebody who's never even heard one song by the Beatles, you're going to get a lot of people who just tune out. And so modern apologetics really isn't speaking to a world who hasn't heard or hasn't seen the beauty of Jesus Christ. They're speaking to themselves. They're talking to they're virtue signaling their fellow tribal members about how loyal they are to the group or to the code. They've lost their way. And this is why you have to go all the way back to two fiction authors to find a decent apologist. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Two men who respected the truth found in myth, who understood the different genres of literature, who understood bad arguments from good, and were fair about things, and actually were good listeners. I just want to lay that on your table today because it's so easy to get caught up in the commotion every Easter and especially at Christmas. The war on Christmas. Make people say Merry Christmas at the register instead of Happy Holidays. Damn it. And I think, in a sense of it, we've really lost our way in that way. I answered that apologist when he said, for Christianity, everything stands or falls on the resurrection of Jesus. I said, that's not true. It's been made to depend on that, but the teachings of Jesus are relevant apart from that. I talked about this with my daughter at lunch yesterday. She said, what are you going to talk about tomorrow? And I talked to her, and she's like, yeah, as if loving your neighbor, just disappears into ashes if Jesus didn't come out of that tomb. As if loving your enemy does. I said Paul was wrong, I don't mind saying that, and you are wrong to funnel everything to an unfalsifiable miracle, an unprovable miracle. See, starting with the resurrection or solely focusing on it allows Christians and skeptics to ignore the full story of Jesus. His words, his life, his ministry, his teachings. I imagine Screwtape would be delighted if he could fully obscure the Christ in a single argument that's not provable. It's the very thing that leads to the phenomena of a majority of evangelicals who would support Beelzebub if he were to run for president, even if he were contrary to every teaching of Jesus. People want to know how evangelical Christians have strayed so far. People want to know what Gandhi meant when he said, if it were just Christ, I would be a Christian. I would go into a church and I would worship him. I'd celebrate him. But when I go into those churches, I find Christians, and they are so unlike the Christ. Another wag has quipped that to view true Christianity, one must ignore nearly all Christians. It's sad. And I'm sure it's not true in every generation and in every place, but it is true in ours. We see Christians with violent rhetoric. We see them angry, hate-filled. We see them othering other groups and other people, even their fellow Americans. We see them defending behavior that's not only contrary to Christ, it is antichrist. And they celebrate it as something that's of Christ. This is all taking the Lord's name in vain. And we do this in front of a generation that we turn around and say, do you know Jesus loves you? And they roll their eyes and they walk away. And I'm going to add this. Rightfully so, because the messenger is so corrupt. The messenger is so characterized by fear and loathing and hatred that they are right to walk away from that. Even if it's a church As my good friend said, sometimes one has to walk away from Christianity to find the true Christ. I think we live in that generation. For many people, we live in that generation. And what does it do? It obscures Jesus and his message. So why don't we do the hard work and start with what we love about Jesus? Maybe our favorite teaching, my favorite parable. This is why I love Jesus. This is why he stands out to me. This is why I find him heroic. Maybe if we introduce the world to the heroic Jesus, to the Jesus who never spoke like this man, who never taught like this man, maybe they'll have a more thirsty ear when we get to the resurrection in the empty tomb. All right. That's all I have for you today from Gilbert, Arizona. I'm signing out with nothing but love. As Carter Sterling used to say, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and drink more milk.